When Rosalind was returning from the supermarket, she saw a car parked on the lawn in front of the building. The neighbors were already outside. The driver was not in the car, but they had already started cursing him. Who did that scoundrel come to visit? The elderly woman asked with a frown. Anna. Men with such expensive cars only come to see Anna. Of course, another neighbor grumbled. Such cars never come to the pensioners. We can only expect an ambulance car. The elderly women stayed near the entrance a little longer, scolded people who didn't care about public order, and didn't forget to discuss the government, which doesn't care about people. At that moment, Anna, whom they were talking about, came out of the building. Not paying attention to elderly women, she went somewhere, but the car remained parked on the lawn apparently. The driver came to visit someone else. The neighbors stared at the girl until she disappeared around the corner of the building. After that, Rosalind hurried home. There was a man standing in front of her apartment. Seeing him, the elderly woman frowned. Rosalind. The man smiled upon seeing that she was about to enter this apartment. I won't buy anything from you. I pay for my apartment on time, and I don't need any loans, Rosalind said immediately, knowing that there are many scammers imposing their goods and services lately. My name is David, the man said with a chuckle. You and I spoke on the phone 2 days ago. Remember? The woman breathed out a sigh of relief. I'm your uncle's son, David. You should have warned me you were coming to visit, the granny said with a sigh. Rosalind opened the door, and they entered the apartment. Wait, is that your car parked on the lawn? She asked unhappily. Is my car on the lawn? The man smiled guiltily. I thought it was a parking lot. A parking lot? David, didn't you see the grass and the flowers? Rosalind asked sternly. Go and park your car somewhere else before the neighbors help you do it. David hurried outside to remove the car from the lawn, and Rosalind went to the kitchen to make tea. She was planning to sell her apartment, but she still didn't want to spoil relations with her neighbors. She would live somewhere else, but the lawn would remain ruined. While they were drinking tea, the elderly woman looked at the man intently because she couldn't remember the last time she'd seen him. Her uncle Samuel had visited them about 30 years ago with a little boy and then stopped communicating. He didn't care about Rosalind's life, and she didn't know how he was doing either. But now, 30 years later, his son had shown up. He seemed a nice young man who smiled all the time, but for some reason, it seemed to Rosalind that there was something wrong with him. Maybe because he smoked cigarettes, smelled like cigarette smoke, and had yellowed teeth. He was a young guy, but he already looked so bad. But anyway, he showed up in her life just in time. The man offered to help an elderly woman to sell her apartment. She was in her 70s and didn't know anything about selling property, and she didn't want to deal with real estate agents, afraid that they might scam her. And David was her relative. She thought she could trust him. She promised him a few $100s for his help, but he refused. Rosalind decided she would give him the money anyway when she sold the apartment and moved to a new place. She planned to sell the apartment and buy a house in a small town and give the rest of the money to charity. But now she decided that she would rather help her relative financially. The woman didn't have a husband or children. As she got older, she realized that she didn't want to live alone in an apartment. She decided to move into a house and enjoy gardening outdoors. She just wanted to go out of the house to her own garden without having to go down the stairs from the 4th floor, as in this old building, where there was no elevator. She and David discussed all the matters about the apartment. Rosalind told him what kind of house she wanted to buy, and in what neighborhood. A day later, the man brought the first person who wanted to buy the apartment. But after he left, Rosalind said, I think it's better to wait until spring. I don't want to move into the house during winter. It's better to do it when it's warm outside. Rosalind. No, the man protested. Do you realize that houses get more expensive in the spring? There's no difference when to sell the apartment, but it's better to buy a house in winter. Besides, you can immediately check how the heating system works. You can buy a beautiful house, but then discover that the heating system doesn't work. This explanation seemed reasonable to her. Later, David told her that the buyer liked the apartment and was ready to purchase it. He insisted that the apartment should be sold as soon as possible. "If I sell the apartment now, where will I live?" Rosalind asked in confusion. "I'll sell the apartment when I find the house." "You're wrong. It's easier to find a house than to sell an apartment. You have an apartment in a building without an elevator. The neighborhood is not prosperous, so you should sell it while they agree to buy it for a good price." "No, I'd rather wait," Rosalind said stubbornly. "I'll sell the apartment only after we find a good house." "All right. Let's do it your way." David softened. "Let's find a nice house first. Then we can sell the apartment and buy a house in one day. Besides, that way there's less paperwork." A few days later, David came to Rosalind and showed her photos of private houses on his phone. The woman chose a few options and wanted to go and see them. Next weekend, David took her to view these houses. The options were not very good, but the price was great. That way Rosalind would have enough money for a good renovation. It turned out David knew a lot about construction and repairs. He told her what materials to buy and how much it would cost. He even promised to help make the repairs. "It's winter. I'd like to move into the house right away and not have to worry about anything," the elderly woman said. "I don't want to do any repairs. I should probably buy a more expensive house." "Rosalind, the roof doesn't leak in this house, and the heating system works properly. We can easily change wallpapers. I'll hire workers, and they'll do it in a day. Just imagine your friends in the city will be sitting in their small apartments, and you'll already be strolling through your own garden." Rosalind was a little alarmed that David insisted on finishing looking for a house and buying any house, even though it wasn't good enough for her. But then she realized there was no profit in it for him, and he simply didn't have the time to drive her to view houses every day. She agreed to buy a house that was in a good location, with a supermarket and bus stop nearby. The house didn't need much renovation and was clean and cozy. On the appointed day, David, the buyer of the apartment, and one more man, who introduced himself as the owner of the house, took Rosalind to the notary to register both transactions. While the notary filled out the paperwork, David brought tea for everyone. The elderly woman was a little nervous because she was selling her apartment. It was a lot of money. Besides, she had lived there all her life, and it was not easy to move somewhere else. She felt uncomfortable that everything had happened so quickly. It seemed that just a week ago she had decided to sell the apartment, and today she was already sitting in a notary's office. It even seemed to her that she was not the one who had made the decision to buy this house. It was David's decision. She sipped some tea, and when the notary gave her the papers to sign, she began to feel dizzy. "I must have been too nervous," she thought. In the last few days, she had been constantly worrying, sorting out her belongings in the apartment and packing them into boxes. After signing the papers, she decided that she needed to calm down. It was already over. Soon she would be enjoying life in a small town in her own house. "The house is waiting for you. You can move in today," the previous owner of the house informed. "Let us take you there right now," David said, "and then I'll bring your belongings there." "What am I going to do in an empty house?" "No, I'm going to go to the apartment now and get my stuff myself," she replied. "By the way, there is a lot of furniture and dishes in the house. Why don't you look at it and tell me what you need, and I'll take away the rest of it," the previous owner of the house said. It seemed to Rosalind that he was also nervous, but she didn't pay any attention to it. David continued to insist on going to the house right now and looking at it again. The old woman agreed, even though it was already evening and it was getting dark outside. The men helped her into the car and drove her to her new home. On the way, the woman began to doze off, and after a while, she lost consciousness. The last thing she heard was the men talking to each other about something. "Rosalind, can you hear me?" She could David's voice, but she didn't have the energy to answer. "Leave her right here. She's going to die anyway," she heard as if in a fog. She woke up from the cold and realized that they had thrown her out of the car onto the ground. The woman could hear the sound of the car that had brought her here. Finally, she realized that David had tricked her. Her intuition was right when the man who introduced himself as the owner of the house seemed suspicious. In fact, a week ago, another man had shown them the house. As it turned out, David put something in her tea and forced her to sign not the papers on the sale of the apartment, but the deed of gift. Lying on the cold ground, she closed her eyes and prepared to die. Meanwhile, a young woman was watching the situation from afar. As she drove by, she saw a car stopped on the side of the road. Thinking that maybe someone needed help, the woman slowed down. But two men got out of the car, pulled something large from the back seats, and headed into the woods. It was raining outside, so the girl couldn't see what they were carrying. But it alerted her. What could these people possibly bring into the woods in the middle of nowhere? It could be some garbage. But what if it was something worse? The girl probably watched too many TV shows, so she immediately made up a crime story in her head. The girl decided to drive a little farther away, stopped the car, turned off the headlights, and waited. She took a pen and notebook to write down the license plate number. When the strange car left, she immediately went to the place where they had thrown something out of the car. She began to suspect them even more of something bad because they left the place in a hurry. The rain outside was getting heavier. The girl quickly ran into the forest following the stranger's footsteps and was horrified to see an elderly woman in the mud. She ran up to her and saw that the granny was unconscious, but she was breathing, so she was alive. The girl immediately started calling her husband and explaining the situation. It was dangerous to leave an elderly woman on the cold, wet ground. Fortunately, she was able to move and, although she could barely understand anything, she got to her feet somehow. They walked slowly to the car, but Granny fell down again and almost lost consciousness. But her rescuer didn't give up. She picked up the stranger and dragged her to the car. Soon an ambulance arrived. The paramedics put her on a stretcher and took her to the hospital. The girl followed the ambulance car. She wanted to make sure the elderly lady was okay and that she had someone to take care of her. Besides, she wanted to find the bastards who almost killed that poor old lady. This granny was very lucky. If the girl hadn't noticed that strange car, the granny would have died in the woods, and the police would never have found the criminals. Doctors at the hospital saved the elderly woman, and her rescuer, Diana, reported the incident to the police station. The girl came to the hospital to check on the elderly lady, but when Diana saw her, she got nervous and didn't know how to react. "Rosalind," Diana said in a trembling voice. "I'm Diana. Do you remember me?" The granny looked closely at the girl and cried. She recognized her, even though the last time she had seen Diana was more than 20 years ago when Diana was a child. Probably, if the girl had not called her by name and introduced herself as Diana, Rosalind would not have recognized her. But now, looking at her plump lips, thin snub nose, and red curly hair, she recognized the little Diana she had cared for many years ago. While the police were investigating the case, the granny had nowhere to live because the apartment was already occupied by other people. So Diana and her husband sheltered Rosalind until the housing issue was resolved. They were in the kitchen, drinking hot tea, talking about the past, and watching Diana's 2-year-old son running quickly around the kitchen. Diana was 8 years old when her mom suddenly felt unwell. Diana lived with her mom, and they had no relatives. Rosalind was working as a paramedic at the time. When she examined Diana's mom, it turned out that she had appendicitis. She was already almost unconscious and needed urgent surgery. "We have to take your mommy to the hospital," Rosalind said to the little girl. "Do you have any relatives or friends? Can you call someone to come and look after you?" The girl shook her head negatively. Her mom only said in a weak voice that they had no one, and her daughter would be all alone. Rosalind didn't hesitate. She packed the child's backpack and took the girl with her. The woman underwent surgery, but she was left in the intensive care unit because she was in critical condition. She was afraid that her daughter might be taken to an orphanage. Rosalind felt sorry for Diana and took the girl home. The woman couldn't have children, and she was happy to take care of this little girl. Diana stayed at Rosalind's home for a whole month until her mother recovered. They became friends, and Rosalind felt what it was like to be a mom. After Diana's mom recovered, they continued to keep in touch. Rosalind went to visit them, brought gifts for the girl, and even took her to work once. But over time, they stopped communicating. Diana and her mother moved to another place, and it was not convenient for Rosalind to go there. Besides, the girl had already grown up now. School, sports, and her friends were taking a lot of her time. The girl had no time to communicate with Rosalind, and now, 20 years later, this little girl was sitting in front of elderly Rosalind. She was already a mom herself. She had adorable 2-year-old John. Her mother died because of poor health before John was born. Diana's mom grew up in an orphanage. She had worked very hard all her life to give her daughter everything she needed. Diana got married, gave birth to a cute baby boy, and was truly happy. Her husband worked as a lawyer in a big company, and Diana was his assistant. Diana's husband helped Rosalind get her apartment back and was going to get David sent to jail for a long time for attempted murder and fraud. Since then, Rosalind had a real caring family. The elderly woman quickly made friends with John. It so happened that she could not have children. But now Diana and her husband treated her like a real mom, like a family member, and little John called her grandma. She offered her help in babysitting the boy, so now Dina could leave her son with his grandmother if she needed to go somewhere, and she didn't have to look for a nanny. By spring, they helped Rosalind sell her apartment and bought a nice house she had dreamed of. Diana's family often came to visit her. When they arrived in the summer, Grandma treated them to berries from her own garden. "Grandma!" John shouted, running up to Rosalind. The boy began to call her that way himself, and the old woman liked it. "Look, there's a scary worm over there. We need to kill it." "John, dear, we don't have to do that," the grandmother said calmly, sitting the boy on her lap. "The worm will dig up the soil. Then we'll put a seed in it, and soon we'll have ripe sweet strawberries. Little John will eat these strawberries and grow up to be a big, strong boy." "But how can a worm dig up the soil?" the boy asked with a laugh. "It doesn't have a shovel." "Even if a worm doesn't have a shovel, it doesn't mean it can't dig the soil." Mom laughed. "If you show mercy now, maybe he'll save your life in the future." "How do I know it will save me?" "Do you see him carrying a shovel now?" Dad asked, and John waved his head negatively. "But he can dig in the soil." Then it turns out that just because you don't see something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Understand? Understand? The boy replied with a smile. "It means God exists." The adults looked at each other in surprise. "Grandma Rosalind says that God is there, but she can't show him. Now I understand it." Hearing this from little John, the adults laughed. Every deed in our life leads us to some result, whether we notice it or not. And if we want a good result, we should do something good in life, even if there are no visible benefits for us.